Imagine a king, lifted high by his people, crowned beneath the watchful gaze of old gods and praised by drums that made the earth tremble, turned and cursed the very land that gave him life. He declared that Yorubaland would one day fall into the hands of foreign rulers. But what wound runs so deep that drives a monarch to spit doom upon the soil of his own birth? Some claim it was merely the bitter groan of a man crushed by shame. Others insist it was something far darker, a true curse, black as a sky without stars, binding generations yet unborn to endless feuds and broken dreams. Even now, the question hangs heavy, has that shadow truly lifted? Across Yorubaland, brothers still tear apart the same house built by their father's sweat. Old grudges spring back like weeds after rain. Pride continues to drive deep cracks, just as it once shattered the mighty throne of Oyo. Once upon a time in ancient Yorubaland, long before the heavy boots of Europeans pressed greed into the warm red earth, there rose a kingdom called Oyo. Oyo was not merely another Yoruba town dotted across the savannah, it was the heartbeat of a people, a giant drum whose echoes traveled far beyond its borders, pumping pride through every Yoruba chest. Its warriors rode on proud horses adorned with charms that jingled like tiny gods whispering protection. The markets overflowed with salt, gold, and stories carried on the backs of men who had crossed hot deserts and rivers that writhed with crocodiles, all just to kneel at Oyo's mighty gates. The palace drums did not simply beat, they roared, rolling through the streets like thunder, making hearts leap and rivals shiver where they stood. It was into this splendor, this powerful nest of wealth, iron, and old songs, that Haole was born around the late 1700s, son of Alaafin Aole, a king whose reach had once stretched Oyo's power like the branches of a giant iroko clawing at the sky. From his very first breath, Haole was swaddled not just in rich cloth but in praise chants thick enough to choke the morning air, hopes heavy enough to bend a boy's shoulders. His lullabies were not soft mother's hums but the sharp calls of elders who saw in his tiny fists the future of an empire. They raised him for a throne many believed was carved by hands older than time, a seat where ancestors sat unseen and whispered their judgments through the palace walls. But by the time Haole ascended the stool to become Alaafin, the Oyo Empire was like a grand masquerade, dazzling on the outside, yet hiding a sickness under its glittering cloth. The treasury, once fat and laughing, strained under the burden of endless military campaigns and lavish ceremonies. Chiefs who once stood lean with duty now waddled with stolen riches, their whispers crawling like sly ants in dark corners of the palace. The Oyo Messi, the sacred council meant to stand firm beside the Alaafin, began to dream their own dreams of power, weaving secret nets in smoky courtyards. Even the mighty Hariona Kakanfo Oyo's supreme war general, a fierce man named Afonja, with eyes sharp as spear tips, strutted through the streets with a pride that sometimes smelled more of hidden ambition than true loyalty. Haole was no fool. His gaze was quick, searching, always dancing from shadow to shadow. Some called him strong, a hunter always alert for snakes under the leaves. Others muttered behind cupped hands that he was cold, harsh, too swift to guard his throne even against those who bowed before it. Under his watch, the palace seemed to breathe heavier, its old wooden beams sighing as if they remembered scars long covered by fresh paint. Servants stepped softer, chiefs laughed with less heart, and somewhere deep in the roots of Oyo's greatness, an old crack waited, patient as a spider. Then came the matter of Yorubaland, a quiet town wrapped in the whispers of ancestors. Yorubaland was no ordinary patch of earth. It was the ancestral womb of the Alaafins, the town from where their mothers' bloodlines flowed like sacred rivers. Long ago, so far back that griots must lean on carved staffs to tell it, a past Alaafin had placed a fearful curse on Yorubaland. With hands lifted to heaven and eyes full of ancestral fire, he declared that any king or general who dared lift a sword against that town would die by the very blade he trusted. His words coiled into the earth like snakes and settled there. From that day, it became an iron law: no Alaafin must ever wage war on Yorubaland. To do so was to hack at the roots of the very tree that held up the royal house. But under Alaafin Haole's reign, the drums changed. The people of Yorubaland, perhaps growing bold under the old protection, stopped sending their tribute to Oyo. Some said they strutted under the shade of the ancient curse, feeling untouchable. Others swore it was Hahole's heavy hand, squeezing taxes and loyalty so tightly that even loyal hearts cracked. Either way, Hahole's pride burned hot. To him, it was an open slap to Oyo's face, a daring cut that the empire could not ignore. His throne could not dance weakly under such insult. So he summoned Afonja, the Hariona Kakanfo, a man whose thin smile was sharp enough to cut kola nuts, whose eyes gleamed with restless storms. Hahole's command thundered through the palace halls. Gather your warriors. March on Uwere. Teach them that even sacred ground is not beyond Oyo's iron. But Afonja did not bow. Instead, his face grew tight, and his voice dropped low, heavy with the weight of old fear. My king, he said, each word slow as dripping oil, you know the curse as well as I do. If I march on Uwere, it will not be their doom, but mine. The ancestors will drag me by my own shadow to the grave. Hahole's nostrils flared. The air seemed to hiss between them. His authority, the same that once bent chiefs and dancers alike, was now being tested by his own war general. The palace seemed to hold its breath, the courtyards listening. The tension thickened, like a sky swelling black before a thunderstorm. Hahole would not be made small. Hoping to prove his might another way, he turned his eyes toward Apamu, a wealthy market town tied by blood and spirit to Hill Lafe, the cradle of all Yoruba peoples. Ordering an attack there was like kicking dust into the face of the ancestors. But Hahole was determined. In 1795, he commanded Afonja to strike Apamu, and Afonja, caught between loyalty and silent grudges, obeyed. The drums of war rolled out across the fields, but behind them slithered softer sounds, whispers of rebellion that wrapped themselves around hearts already tired of Hahole's rule. Afonja felt the choke of the king's orders tightening around his neck. His pride, wounded by the Uwere demand, and his fear of what might come next, drove him to seek dangerous help. He stretched out his hand to the Oyo Messi, who were already grumbling under Hahole's heavy rule. Then, to seal his rising power, he joined forces with Shualimi, also called Solejanta, a Fulani cleric whose words carried holy weight and whose followers were quick to raise their spears for faith. Together, they formed a pact thick with hidden daggers. When the trap was ready, they moved not with loud swords but with a tradition older than many rivers. They sent to Hahole a silent killer, an empty calabash. No words needed to be etched on its smooth shell. Every Yoruba heart knew what it meant. Your people reject you. Take your own life, so royal blood does not stain our hands. When the calabash reached Hahole's palace, it was as if the sun dimmed. Betrayal rose around him like thorn bushes. His own war general, his chiefs, the very council meant to guard his crown, had turned. His heartbeat slowed under the weight of humiliation. And somewhere, perhaps in the rafters of that palace heavy with dust and old incense, the ancestors watched, their faces hidden, waiting to see what Alaafin Aole would do next. When Alaafin Aole received the empty calabash, something inside him cracked like dry earth under a cruel sun. His heart twisted under the sharp teeth of betrayal. These were the very people he had labored to keep under the weight of his rule, the chiefs fat with power because he let them feast, the Oyo Messi, the kingmakers sworn by oath to guard his stool, and Afonja, his own war general, who once stood before him with a bow low enough to kiss dust. Now, all of them had woven a net around his throne, leaving him caught like a goat at slaughter. He was Alaafin, living vessel of Oyo's gods, seated on a stool carved by ages and drenched in the breath of ancestors. Yet here he was, commanded by the very customs that upheld him, expected to take his own life, to step willingly into death so royal blood would not soak the ground by another's hand. But before he bent to tradition, Hahole wrapped himself in the lonely silence of his palace chambers. There, he performed secret rites known only to a line of kings who had danced with gods in their dreams. He stood before his household gods, eyes dark pools of pain and fury, and poured out words so heavy it seemed for a moment the sun lost its shine. His voice was low, ragged, carrying a grief sharp enough to cut the world. Since my own people, those fed by my hand, those lifted by my throne, have betrayed me, let trust rot from their blood. May brothers never trust brothers again. May your lands drink no peace. May war rise and rise, spreading across all Yorubaland like fire in Harmattan grass. May your sons and daughters be snatched, chained, sold into strange lands where their tears will water fields they do not own, forever crying for a home they will never see again. The words crawled from his mouth like snakes, slithering into the unseen corners of the earth, coiling themselves around the roots of every family tree that would grow after him. Then, bound by the very laws that made him king, Aole took his own life. And with that final breath, he sealed the curse, a shadow that would walk hand in hand with Yorubaland long after his bones had turned to dust. The Awith grave of a dying king carries a weight few can measure. Aole's last words did not float away like weak smoke. They fell into the ground like iron seeds, sprouting dark roots that spread through Yorubaland with frightening speed. Almost at once, the curse began to show its claws. Afonja, now swollen with pride and drunk on newfound power, tightened his grip on Shualimi, believing that the Fulani cleric's blessings and warriors would keep his rule safe. He opened wide the gates of Ilorin, letting Fulani horsemen flood in, replacing many of his own Yoruba men, whom he quietly suspected might still lean toward the old order. Without knowing it, Afonja was digging his own grave, each handshake with the Fulani another shovel of dirt tossed over his shoulder. When Shualimi died, his son Abdulsalam quietly rolled up plans like sleeping mats, waiting for the right moment to strike. By the time Afonja's eyes cleared, it was far too late. The Fulani turned on him, seized Ilorin, and killed the very man who had once paraded through its streets with a chest high and eyes daring any to challenge him. The fall of Ilorin was only the first drumbeat in a long funeral song. Aole's curse began to blossom fully across Yorubaland, unfolding like dark petals in every town and compound. Kingdom rose against kingdom. Brothers gathered armies to face cousins across dusty fields. The long Yoruba civil wars drained the land of laughter, burned villages to ash, and left hearts heavy with suspicions that crawled from house to house like restless spirits. While Yoruba swords were busy carving each other's flesh, the Atlantic slave trade found easy paths through the chaos. Slave raiders and middlemen marched into weakened towns, chains rattling like evil bells. The sons and daughters of those who once proudly walked Oyo's courtyards, whose ancestors had sat under canopies heavy with honor, were now bound wrist to wrist, neck to neck, driven to the coast like cattle. There they were loaded into ships that rocked on black waves, taking them to lands where their names would be twisted or forgotten altogether. So by the time the British arrived in the late 1800s, eager to wrap their own chains of taxes and foreign laws around Yoruba necks, they found a people already weakened by years of spilling each other's blood. Some might blame only greed, European rifles, or gunpowder that burned too bright. But in quiet gatherings under the moon, old men still puff slow on their pipes, look into the distance, and murmur that it was simply Aole's curse doing its work, driving Yorubaland under foreign feet exactly as he had sworn. Today we walk paved streets built over the bones of mighty empires. We dance at festivals, clap at markets, lift songs that rise like smoke into the evening sky. Yet somewhere deep inside those songs, there is always a faint note of sorrow, as if our voices remember. As if the wind itself still carries the echo of a king's dying curse, whispering how pride, betrayal, and disunity can crack even the strongest throne, leaving only dust and quiet regrets behind.